Everyone. So welcome back to Ancient Wisdom, Modern Life, where we explore the lessons we learned from Judaism and try to apply them to our modern life. So let me start with a story. Firstly, we're going to be speaking about grief and Shiva today. I'll explain a lot more, but to start off a story, a couple of years ago, I walked into a restaurant that we know the hostess well. She is lovely and she looks after us. Every time we walk in, there's this gorgeous greeting. And I walked in and she wasn't herself. So I asked her what was going on. And she told me that the day before her father passed away. I was shocked. Firstly, this is a kosher restaurant, so it was beyond shocking to me because I knew she wasn't Jewish, but the fact that the day after her father passed away, she was doing her job. She was in the restaurant hosting, being smiley and happy for all the people there, and it really, really surprised me. But I don't know why it did. I know that in Jewish law, we have a very formulaic approach to grief, to grieving, to mourning, and that it doesn't actually exist outside of the Jewish world. But it really took me aback. And I wanted to talk to her about it and think about it with her, but she's a hostess in a restaurant, and that is not what she was going to do. And by the way, she's been a hostess for a Jewish clientele for a very, very long time. So she may have encountered the idea of Shiva and the very formulaic way we look at it, but she wasn't experiencing it. My gift, if I could give a gift to the world, would be Shiva. How do I give that to everyone? So I'm going to start with this video and share lessons I learned from watching my husband this week sit Shiva and things I'd love to teach everyone, starting with myself, my family, my community, my people, and then lots of other people, if at all possible. Even though this platform is tiny, hopefully the message can get out and other people will repeat it in their own words. So let's get started. Lessons I learned from watching my husband sit Shiva. Here we go. Lesson 1. Grief breaks us. Shiva mends us. So this past week, my husband was sitting Shiva for his sister after a very long battle with cancer. My husband's sister passed away just over a week ago, and I got to be present, and it's a real privilege in not just watching my husband sit Shiva, being there for him the entire week, but also assisting him in some small ways with it. Just being the person who answered the door and served the meals. It was a massive privilege to be in that position, but also it gave me an insight to watch someone sit Shiva for an entire week. I've been to pay my respects, condolences to people who are sitting Shiva, including my own parents, but I was in and out. I wasn't really there all the time. And even with one of my grandmothers, I was there all the time, but I had my siblings with me, and I wasn't the only one. In this instance, for a variety of reasons, I was really the only one who was hosting, if that's even possible, the Shiva house. And the lesson I learned is that grief breaks us, but Shiva mends us. We will all experience some sort of grief in our lifetimes. That's just the inevitability of life. And when someone close to us passes, it breaks a part of us. They're part of our heart, and that part is torn off. We experience that when, in Jewish custom, when you lose someone who's close to you, be it a parent, a spouse, a sibling, or a child, your shirt is torn. To symbolize that tearing in your heart. So something is broken, something is torn, and sitting Shiva actually helps mend that. You get a week to process some of that grief, not all of it, but in Judaism's timeless wisdom, long before anyone spoke about psychology, there was already the idea that some part of you will be emotionally broken when you lose someone that close to you, and you're going to need time. And time really does heal most wounds, not all of them. Time moves forward and we move forward with it. And memories are just that. They're in the past. And you need to start separating yourself. And this intense time of sitting Shiva actually helps you to say, I'm going to acknowledge that part of me is broken, and sitting Shiva is going to be part of that healing process. People who don't sit Shiva, like that hostess who had no concept of it, or people in my community who are sitting fewer and fewer days of Shiva, aren't experiencing that mending process. You hear it often from people who are very observant, who, because of a holiday, so let's say someone passes away just before Passover, just before Pesach, they don't actually get to sit Shiva for more than a few minutes if, let's say, the person is buried just before the Seder or just before Sukkot or Rosh Hashanah. There's like a break in that sitting Shiva, and they'll years later say, I didn't get to experience that, and I really needed that time. So lesson one is that grief breaks us, and Shiva helps to mend us. Lesson two I learned from watching my husband sit Shiva for his sister: the power of stillness and presence. So when you're sitting Shiva, you are really not allowed to do many things. You have to abstain from work. You have to abstain from really bathing yourself for pleasure. You do it for hygiene. Mirrors are covered in order that it's not about vanity, it's about self-reflection. You sit on these low chairs, and the focus really is on stillness. You're not allowed to really leave the house unless it's to go to another place where you're sitting Shiva. Everything is conducted in a very quiet and still manner. And in modern life, especially, where there is so much movement and so much noise, that to be still actually encourages you to be present, to be in the moment. And Shiva urges you to be quiet, to be still. People come to you. Yes, there's a lot of talking when you have a room full of people visiting the mourners, but there's a stillness in the fact that you can't really do anything. You don't pick up the phone and call people, they call you. You don't go out and visit people, they visit you. You're not meant to leave the house, people come to you, the food comes to you. You're not even really meant to make yourself a cup of coffee, someone else will make it for you. And in that stillness, all you have to do is think. And you get an opportunity that I don't think is present outside of this time and space to really reflect on the person that you've lost, on who you are now, that that person is no longer in your life. And Shiva enforces that. The power of stillness and presence is the underlying foundation of Shiva, that you need to be still. You need to stop because your heart has stopped. You've lost someone, and the only way to respect that is to stop yourself and take the time to reflect on the person and who you are now, that the person is no longer in your life. Who were they? There's so many ideas going through your head that if you were getting on with your life, if you were going back to work, you wouldn't have the time to think and reflect on that specificness. So the gift of Shiva, and lesson number two, is the power of stillness and presence. Lesson three of Shiva: the responsibility and blessing of community. I don't even know where to begin with this. In all honesty, I have always been part of a community. To be a practicing Jew, you can't actually practice Judaism properly if you're not in a community. It is the community structure that Judaism happens in. Yes, we have our personal obligations, commandments, transgressions. It happens on a very personal level, but it also happens within a community. And so much of Jewish life is community based. We speak about the community all the time, be it our small insular community of the synagogue, be it our school communities, be it our larger Jewish community in our city, in our country, in the world. We always speak about the community. So when someone passes away, the community actually has a responsibility. They need to step up. So someone passes away, it's on the community to take care of a lot of things, be it the burial, be it the looking after the corpse, be it everything involved, and Shiva. So a person sits Shiva, all of a sudden, everything they could do for themselves is really not allowed. So they're not allowed to look after themselves, but someone has to. So the community needs to step up to look after them. The community has to visit them. It's part of the obligation of being part of a community. And it comes with that huge amount of responsibility, but there is so much comfort in it. And what I love about community is that death is inevitable, grief is inevitable, it's part of life. And may it not happen to any of us ever, but it will. We all age. It's part of life as it is today. And the community needs to step up and look after you, and you, in your turn, will look after them. And it's a symbiotic relationship where you're never really alone when you're part of a community. So sometimes it's hard to be part of a community. There's a lot of, the stuff that community brings. Sometimes it's gossip, sometimes it's hurt feelings. Sometimes people feel they take up on too many responsibilities and others take up none. And that's part of being people. People are people, and everyone reacts and acts in different ways. But at times of mourning, especially in Shiva, you see our community at its best. People really step up for each other. Either they've experienced the grief, either they've sat Shiva, or they're aware that one day they will, and they want to be looked after the same way they're looking after someone else. So I've learned that being part of a community is both a responsibility, but it is such a blessing. And I can't imagine a world or a life where I wasn't part of a community. And Judaism only really functions within community. We need community for Judaism to exist, to progress. And I am so blessed to be part of a community, our small community and our larger community. Lesson number 4. Grief follows a pattern, and that is a gift. I'm sure many of us have heard of the 5 stages of grief. I needn't go through it, but I want to show you how Judaism both respects that pattern and has an answer to that pattern. So when someone passes away, until they're buried, you're what's called an onen. It's this limbo phase where you don't really know what to do with yourself. Where do you put yourself? That woman that went to work the following day after her father passed away is an example of, no, you're not meant to be at work. You have just suffered a devastating loss. Where do you put yourself? When people outside of Judaism and Islam don't bury their dead for a week, 2 weeks, even more, there's this limbo phase where you're like, oh, what do I do now? Where do I go? Judaism limits that limbo to as small as possible. It recognizes that limbo is not a good phase for anyone to be in. It's an unbalancedness that we seek, we desire with all our hearts balance, I believe, more than anything else. And while that body isn't properly buried, you are in limbo. So that's phase 1. Then there's the levaya, the funeral. But then we go to Shiva. Shiva lasts 7 days. And during that time, it's the most intense time of mourning for the mourners. As you said, there are all these things they're not allowed to do, and there are all these responsibilities that the community needs to do for them. The second part of that mourning, that grief cycle, is the shloshim, which is the 30 days from the time that the person was buried. So you have a week, and then essentially you have another 3 weeks, but all encompassing, it's the 30 days. And for those 30 days, someone still isn't allowed to shave and groom themselves properly. If you're a woman, you're not really allowed to go for a haircut. So there are different parts of that. If you've lost a sibling, you only say the Kaddish prayer, which is the prayer for the mourners during that shloshim. That's the most intense period after the week of Shiva. So you're progressing yourself more into the world. You're allowed to return to work, but you're definitely not allowed to go to the theater or to a wedding, say, unless it's a close family member, in which case there are all these stipulations that have to happen. And I'm definitely not going to go into that. But basically, you kind of extract yourself a little bit more from that intense Shiva period, those 7 days, into the shloshim, which is a little bit less, but still quite intense. And then you have a year. During that year, you're not allowed to buy new clothing. You're not allowed to attend the theater or live music. Again, there are exceptions when needed. And you're allowed to shave. And groom yourself, but it's still a form of mourning. If you've lost someone like a parent, you do have to say the Kaddish prayer for the entirety of that year. And it recognizes that to lose someone that close to you, it's not going to pass in a week, and it's not going to pass in a month. It's not going to pass in a year, but the pain and the grief will get slowly a little bit less and less, and they're never out of your life. So once a year, you are going to, on the day of their death, remember them and say a prayer for them. And then during some of our festivals, we do say what's called Yisker, where you get an opportunity once again to remember those people who you have lost. So basically, Judaism acknowledges that grief is at its most intense for the week following the burial. It recognizes that you're in limbo when that person has died and before they're buried, that you can't really think straight. And then the grief gets easier to manage and easier to handle with more time. But it has you entering back into the world in a very slow fashion. You get more and more into the world at a very regimented pace. And then you're really meant to be remembering that person a few times a year. So it respects us as people and our grief. It respects the pattern that most people experience in grief, obviously not everyone. And Judaism is formulaic in it says, well, let's say you don't experience that. Let's say for whatever reason, the grief you're experiencing is completely different. It says, well, this is the way you respect that person, regardless of how you feel for them. Be it way too much grief, it doesn't allow you to grieve beyond a year, or be it no grief, and it says, well, actually, you do have to grieve for them for that year. Judaism kind of boxes you into this place where it says, this is what we think is best for you. And we have a lot of experience here. So the lesson number 4 was grief follows a pattern, and that is a gift. In conclusion, I want to discuss 2 words, Shiva and Yeshiva. So Shiva means 7, and what my husband just did was called Shiva. And the root of that word is Shin Bet Ayin. So all Hebrew words have roots, and usually the roots are 3 letters, sometimes 2. So the root of the word Shiva, which is 7, where are we? 7, is Shin Bet Ayin. There's another word that sounds very similar, which is Yeshiva, which is to sit, but it's a different root. The root of that word is Yud Shin Bet. And Yeshiva means to sit. Students who go to Yeshiva, which is where many people learn in the Jewish community, the reason it's called Yeshiva is because they're sitting and learning. So why am I telling you about the word Shiva, which is the process of mourning for someone who you're a close relative when you've been bereaved, and Yeshiva? Because they sound very the same. The 7-day period, the easiest way to remember it is when you hear the word Yeshiva. You're meant to sit. You're meant to sit in your grief. You're meant to acknowledge that you're in pain, that you've lost someone who was part of your world, part of your life, part of your heart, and they're no longer there. And Judaism acknowledges that. It doesn't want you to move on today. It wants you to move on, but eventually, after you've had time to sit Shiva, those 7 days of Yeshiva, of sitting, it's meant to be reflective. It's meant to be empowering so that you can sit with that pain, sit with that grief, and then move forward in a very measured, controlled way, and then emerge back into the world at the right pace. And I think that Judaism always, always blows me away, but never more so that when it understands our psychology, it just gets us as people. If you didn't believe before something like this that there's a plan and that Torah is a God-given gift, to me, Shiva is one of those prime examples that there's a higher power, there's something beyond us that understands. When someone dies in Judaism, we say Baruch Dayan HaEmet, which is blessed is the judge of truth, that only God knows. Only God knows why someone has to die. Only God decides that, not us. We will reflect, we will remember, we will try to make sense of it, but ultimately it's all according to God's plan and God's wish. I wish comfort to all the mourners, and I hope that together we can remember the people who are part of our lives and mourn them appropriately, and bring joy and comfort to those who are left behind. See you all soon.